Hello, Kekawashib. It's Mr. Jennifer Deibel. Agus tá méid so go mór leis an Rose of the ICC. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Deibel. I am so excited to be able to participate in this Rose of the Irish Cultural Center. I am from Glendale, Arizona. I will be 42 on November 9th. My Celtic heritage, my maiden name is Martin. My dad's family came from the Martin stronghold in the Galway area. And my favorite memory of the ICC was the Women's Day conference that they did earlier this year. It was just such a neat time. I was able to connect with some amazing women, have a cup of tea, a real cup of tea, and it really set the tone for my year. And so that was really exciting. I love being AZ Irish because it's like having a family within my own family. We spent 6 years living in Ireland and having to leave. The biggest thing we missed were the people and the relationships that we had to leave behind there, let alone the land and the music and the language. And being Arizona Irish, I get to be back in all of that, and it's such a blessing. If I could give a piece of advice to myself, my younger self, I would say don't be so afraid to mess up. That sometimes the mistakes you make turn out to be one of the biggest blessings that you could imagine. So learn from the mistakes. Don't be afraid. Don't spend so much time trying to have it all together and be perfect. The party trick I'd like to share with you today is reading an excerpt from my debut novel, which comes out in February. Legalese, I am reading this with permission from Ravel Publishers, and it's not the completely finished package. You'll have to wait for February for that. But this story was born from my years in Ireland, specifically the 2 years we spent in Donegal. So the book is called A Dance in Donegal. It follows the story of Maura Doherty, who moves from Boston to her mother's home village of Ballyman in Donegal, a fictitious village. And so this excerpt I'm going to share with you today, she's been there for a few days, she's met a few people, and she's been invited to her new acquaintance's house for dinner. But when she gets there, it's not all what she expected. Maura gathered the freshly baked scones she'd made to take to the McGonagall family and made her way to Sinead's house. Maura rounded the corner. Her step slowed and her mouth fell open. Though it was a modest bungalow with gleaming white walls, topped with a clean thatch and a door as black as coal, the house crawled with people. A group of at least 24 more milled about the property. Smoke curled lazily from pipes. Stout laughter and the lilt of Gaelic conversations melded into a symphony of Irish delight. Conversations lulled to whispers and feet shuffled this way and that as Maura approached. Men gave a slight tip of their caps but refused to look her in the eye. Women dipped shallow curtsies and mumbled a "Wunshore" as she passed. "Hello," the word caught in her throat. She nodded in greeting and searched the open door for any sign of a friendly face. "Maura, you came!" Sinead bounded from the bungalow, arms outstretched. Relief rolled over Maura as she embraced her friend. "So much for a quiet family gathering, eh?" Sinead's brow furrowed. "What?" "Well, when you said to come over." You thought it would just be ye coming, did you?" Sinead laughed. Maura nodded. Go on now. We gather every Sunday night for the crack." Finally, a Gaelic word she recognized. "Well, let's hope the crack is mighty then," Maura declared. Sinead erupted into breath-stealing guffaws. You're a good woman yourself, Maura Doherty." She wrapped a broad arm around Maura's shoulder and led her into the house. The air inside was thick with smoke, heavy with the blazing turf fire and the heat of far too many bodies stuffed into too small a space. Maura pressed a hand to her cheeks, letting the chill from her walk past her already heated face. Sinead made a few cursory introductions, but Maura was met only with gruff nods and averted eyes. At her mother's bidding, Sinead scurried off to pour tea, leaving Maura alone in a sea of strangers. An older gentleman nursing a pint of ale was the only one willing to look at her. His face was dour and puckered, from age or a cantankerous personality she couldn't tell. Mora thought his eyes, squinting in discerning slits, held a gleam that belied his grim expression. The same could not be said for the other parishioners. Mora fought to hold back the tears stinging her eyes. Did the whole town believe her to be evil? Frustration mounted, and Mora began to think she preferred the loneliness of yet another night in her chalet to the hateful silence thrust upon her here. She had just turned to leave when a voice near the hearth caught her ear. Craning to see around woolen-clad bodies and over a sea of flat caps, Mora caught a glimpse of familiar green eyes. Sean jumped to his feet, putting whatever conversation he was in to an abrupt end. "Miss Doherty!" He waved and began to navigate the gauntlet of people making his way toward her. Given the throng pressing in around them, he made it to her side with impressive speed. "How are you?" Mora scanned the crowd before bringing her gaze back to his. She stood silent for a moment, trying to rein in her thoughts. Why must his eyes be so enchanting? He inclined his head, brows raised, clearly awaiting her reply. "Well, this is certainly not what I had in mind when Sinead invited me to call over tonight. Is the entirety of Ballyman in this bungalow?" A nervous laugh escaped her lips. "Very nearly," he replied. "The McGonagall's Sunday gatherings are the stuff of Donegal legend. I know it's a bit overwhelming now, but just give it a chance. You're going to love it, I promise." Moira shrugged. "Perhaps. I just can't help but think everyone here hates me." She lowered her voice just above a whisper. "I feel like perhaps Ajax isn't bluffing, that maybe there is something dark in my past and everyone knows it but me." Sean's expression showed compassion, trying hard to comfort. "If your mother was anything tall like you, there can be no substance to Ajax or Buok's claims." He stepped closer. "And even if there were, it would have no bearing on your own character." Mora smiled. "Thank you, Sean. That means a great deal." Her arms ached to wrap themselves around him, letting him protect her forever. Instead, she twisted her fingers and forced herself not to get lost in his eyes. She was discomfited by the intensity of her feelings and the swiftness with which they had gone from annoyance to attraction. Thwap, thwap! Mr. McGonagall rapped a shillelagh on the doorpost. The crowd fell silent as bodies lowered onto creepies, chairs, and whatever empty spot on the floor was available, leaving a space no bigger than a 2-foot square in the center of the room. Mora found a stool near the edge of the crowd, and Sean slipped to the back with some of the other men. The host launched into a swift-spoken Gaelic greeting before turning attention to the dour-faced man Mora had noticed before. The gathering erupted into a rousing round of applause, and whoops and hollers filled the small room. The old man waved a hand, quieting them. He scanned his audience, mischief lighting up his eyes. Mora relaxed a mite, despite the less than warm welcome she had received from him mere moments earlier. Sinead spotted her from across the room and headed towards her friend. When the silence had stretched to his satisfaction and the crowd seemed sufficiently baited, he began. "An Grianan Ailach." Sounded like a title. At once, Sinead's voice was in Mora's ear. "He's telling the story of the Grianan of Ailach. It's an ancient ring fort half a day's ride from here." Mora nodded. She was completely captivated by the story, though she understood not a word. The crowd, equally drawn in, offered in unison boos and hisses or alternately cheers and hurrahs. At the tale's end, the packed room exploded in applause and cheers. The dour-faced man, now bearing the slightest of grins, stood, offered a little bow, and hobbled back to his seat in the corner. "Inish!" Mr. McGonagall called. "Kjol!" As if from nowhere, all manner of instruments materialized. Mora counted 3 fiddles, 2 Irish flutes, a bowron, and a set of uilleann pipes. Hands clapped and feet tapped as the musicians played a heart-pumping set of reels and jigs. During a particularly rousing reel, driven by a strong bowron undertone, a lone figure hopped into the empty space in the middle of the floor. Mora was stunned to see Colum before her, his eyes closed, feet tapping furiously. Colum's arms dangled loosely, and a look of sheer bliss rested on his face. His feet shuffled in a blur with an occasional toe tap or heel scrape punctuating a phrase in the music. It had been ages since Mora had seen anyone perform a traditional Shawno stance, and she was drawn in heart and soul. The song finished, and Colum ended his dance with a flourish, arms raised over his head in triumph. The crowd offered their appreciation for the show, and Mora joined in the applause. When the hoopla settled once more, Mr. McGonagall opened the floor for requests. "We need a song!" a voice called from the back wall. "Aye! Go on now, sing us a song so!" The grocer raised both his hands in surrender. Okay, a song yous want, a song you'll get." The crowd cheered in unison. "But I doubt yous want a song sung by the likes of me." "Nay, Lord, help us no. Who'll you have then?" he asked. Various names were murmured from the crowd, none of which were familiar to Maura. Then Colum lifted halfway out of his seat and called, "Sean McFadden, sing ye a song." Maura's gaze flew to Sean, who was leaning up against the wall near the hearth, arms folded across his chest. He shook his head in protest, but the crowd wouldn't back down. At last, he acquiesced and made his way to the center. Finding a spot in the midpoint of the floor, he settled himself, hands placed comfortably in his pockets, eyes closed, signaling his readiness to begin. The crowd fell silent. Sean inhaled, and when the first note released into the air, Maura clutched her heart. His voice was like silk on velvet, masculine yet without the gravelly quality so many men seemed to possess. The song, sung a cappella entirely in Gaelic, was melancholy and beautiful all at once. Maura ached at the sound of it, and never wanted the song to end. Sudden pain shot through Maura's side, and she turned to the source. Sinead's elbow rammed repeatedly into Maura's ribs. "What?" she whispered to her friend, unable to keep the irritation from her voice. "No wonder your man is singing this song." Her eyes sparkled with delight. "'Tis called Ban Dubh the Dark Woman of the Glen." "It's lovely, but it's about a dark-haired lass so beautiful," Sinead said. "It makes a man lament. The man cannot eat nor sleep until he sees her again. He watches his flocks in the day, but his thoughts are consumed only by her beauty. And although every lad from Donegal to Dublin tries to win her hand, he purposes to make her his bride." Maura knitted her brows in confusion and stared at Sinead. Sinead rolled her eyes and held up a tendril of Maura's black hair. "Don't you see, Maura? He's singing about ye." Maura turned her attention back to Sean. Sinead whispered the English translation of each line in her ear as he sang. Maura's heart quickened, wondering at her friend's prediction. Surely he wasn't singing about her. It was simply a traditional song to which Sean was partial, wasn't it? The warmth of his voice filled the air, and the entire crowd seemed just as enchanted as Maura. Heat rose up her neck and radiated to her face, setting her ears on fire. Inside her, it was as if Colum's feet were dancing, setting her stomach in delightful, terrifying whirl. As Sean sang the last line of the song, he opened his eyes and looked at Maura long and deep. Sinead whispered the lyric's final meaning, hoping to win the dark maid's affection. Thanks.